And children will be taught to sound words out rather than, as has been the case, simply guess at words based on context or book illustrations. I don't think many would argue there's not a compelling need for the change. Fully 1/4 of Victorian students failed to meet NAPLAN proficiency standards for literacy last year. Joining me to discuss this is Victoria's Shadow Education Minister, Jess Wilson. Jess, thanks for joining me. The Liberals took this policy to the last 2 elections, but it's only now being adopted by the Labor government. Is common sense finally prevailing here?
Well, good to be with you, James. And you're right, we did take this to the last election. 6 years ago, at the 2018 election, we took a comprehensive phonics-based policy to the election, and then again in 2022. And today we've seen the Labor government finally drag to what has been evidence across the board for more than 20 years that this is the way to teach children to read. In Victoria, we've got some really concerning numbers when it comes to our outcomes at a learning level. We're seeing kids right across school levels, years 3, 5, 7 and 9, nearly 1/3 of them are not meeting proficiency standards when it comes to literacy. And when you look at the international data, the PISA data, for 15-year-olds, we've got record lows across numeracy, literacy and science. So this is a belated announcement. It's one that the government has dragged their feet on, but we're pleased that finally Victorian students will be able to learn in the classroom. Unfortunately, though, we're seeing it still dragged out further with the timeline the Labor Minister has put forward today.
Yeah, well, I was interested to read that Melbourne's 300 Catholic schools didn't wait for a government edict. They've already started teaching phonics and have seen marked improvement. Why the reticence to adopt the phonics model in public schools?
Well, the evidence has been clear on the need for evidence-based learning, on phonics, on explicit instruction for over 20 years. Now, the Labor Minister admitted as much today that this has been the case. And Labor has been in power for 21 of the last 25 years here in Victoria, but has failed to actually adopt the evidence. We saw the Catholic Archdiocese here in Melbourne adopt phonics earlier this year. I was at the launch and we put out a press release at the time welcoming that decision. We've been talking about this issue since the last election and calling on the government to make sure that phonics is in the classroom. What's really important here is children don't innately learn to read. They don't just pick up reading, they don't just pick up words. We have to teach them how to read. And so it's really important that we put in place phonics. And I think, I learned to read through my parents sounding out words. Many children learn to read like this. And it's important now that this is going to be the case in Victoria. But we do have concerns with the rollout of the policy today. Of course, Victoria is continuing their choose their own adventure approach, not adopting the national screening test, but instead using their controversial test here in Victoria. We don't have any sense of whether this will be compulsory in every classroom, with the Minister saying that it'll be still up to teachers to decide whether this works for children. So we have concerns across the rollout of this policy, and we just can't afford to leave any children behind.
As you say, there's been plenty of evidence to say that phonics is the best way to teach children to read. So why did schools move away from it? Was it an evidence-based move, or was this an ideological thing? And is that one of the reasons why some schools are reticent to go back to phonics? It's an ideological issue.
It's certainly been an ideological issue here in Victoria. The evidence has been clear for over 20 years. We've had report after report telling us that evidence-based learning, explicit instruction, the use of phonics in the classroom is essential to lifting our standards here in Victoria, meeting those learning outcomes for students. And time again, we've seen NAPLAN results, we've seen international data show that we're falling behind. Unfortunately, we've got a Labor government here that has had an ideological approach. They've continued with this choose your own adventure in the classroom, this balanced literacy approach, and that's been sort of hampered further by the Department of Education here refusing to move on this issue, and of course the union movement as well having an influence.
Yeah, well, I remember when I was at school, we learned to read using phonics, so it seems like everything old is new all over again. Jess Wilson, thanks so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks so much.